The winter of 1843 brought more than just snow to the remote hills of western Massachusetts. It brought secrets that would remain buried for over a century and a half, hidden beneath the floorboards of what locals called the Old Stone Chapel. When those floorboards were finally torn up in 1971 during renovation work, construction workers discovered something that would shake the very foundations of American religious history. Beneath the rotting wood lay the skeletal remains of 23 men, each wearing the tattered remnants of clerical robes. Each skeleton bore evidence of systematic torture, fractured skulls that had healed before death, rib bones showing signs of repeated breaking and mending, strange markings carved deep into the bone itself, symbols that no expert could identify. But most disturbing of all were the iron shackles still locked around their wrists and ankles, as if these men had been imprisoned for months or even years before their deaths. The discovery sent shockwaves through the Catholic Church hierarchy. Emergency meetings were called in Boston, New York, and Washington. Federal agents arrived within hours, sealing the site and removing all evidence before local authorities could conduct a proper investigation. The official story released to the press was sanitized, clinical. An old burial ground had been discovered. The remains were being respectfully relocated. Nothing more to see here, but the truth was far more sinister. These weren't just any remains. They were the missing priests of St. Agnes Church, men who had vanished without a trace between 1851 and 1859. Men whose disappearances had been explained away as transfers to distant parishes, voluntary departures from religious life, or simple wanderings of troubled souls. For over a century, their fate had remained one of the Catholic Church's most closely guarded secrets. I've spent years tracking down documents that powerful people tried to bury forever. Church records that were sealed and hidden, government files that were classified and forgotten, personal journals that survived only because someone had the courage to hide them away. What I've discovered is a story so horrifying that even today, certain archives remain locked away in basement vaults, accessible only to those with the highest security clearances. The story begins in 1848 when Father Thomas Brennan arrived at St. Agnes Church in the small town of Millbrook, Massachusetts. At 42 years old, Father Brennan was everything a parish priest should be, educated at the finest seminaries, fluent in Latin and Greek, with a reputation for powerful sermons and unwavering devotion to his flock. The parishioners of St. Agnes welcomed him with open arms, grateful to finally have a permanent priest after years of visiting clergy who came and went like the seasons. But Father Brennan was not what he appeared to be. Born Patrick Murphy in County Cork, Ireland, he had indeed studied for the priesthood, but his ordination papers were forgeries. His letters of recommendation were fabricated. His entire identity as Father Thomas Brennan was a carefully constructed lie designed to infiltrate the American Catholic Church for purposes that wouldn't become clear until it was far too late. The first sign that something was wrong came in the spring of 1851. Father Michael O'Sullivan, a young priest from Boston, arrived at St. Agnes for what was supposed to be a routine visitation. He was there to conduct the annual inspection of church finances, review the parish records, and ensure that everything was operating according to church law. Father O'Sullivan was thorough, methodical, and unfortunately for him, very observant. What he discovered in the church ledgers didn't make sense. Large sums of money were being donated to the parish, far more than a small rural church should be receiving. The donors were listed as wealthy benefactors from Boston and New York. But when Father O'Sullivan tried to verify these names, he found that many of them didn't exist. More disturbing were the expenses. When Father O'Sullivan asked Father Brennan to explain these entries, the older priest's demeanor changed completely. There are aspects of God's work that require discretion, Father Brennan said, his Irish accent thickening as it always did when he was agitated. The church has many needs that go beyond the understanding of simple parish priests. But Father O'Sullivan was not easily intimidated. That evening, he conducted his own investigation of the church grounds. What he found in the basement beneath the altar would haunt him for the rest of his life, though that life would prove to be tragically short. The basement had been expanded far beyond its original size. Tunnels extended in multiple directions, creating a network of chambers that stretched beneath the entire church and beyond. In one chamber, Father O'Sullivan found evidence of recent construction work. Fresh mortar, newly laid stones, and the unmistakable smell of lime. In another, he discovered items that had no place in any house of God. Iron shackles bolted to the walls, instruments that looked suspiciously like torture devices. And most disturbing of all, a collection of clerical robes and personal effects that belonged to priests who had supposedly left the parish for assignments elsewhere. Father O'Sullivan recognized Father David Kelly's prayer book, the one with the distinctive water stain on the cover. Father Kelly had departed St. Agnes 6 months earlier, supposedly transferred to a mission in California. But if he had left for California, why was his most precious possession still here? And why was it stained with what looked suspiciously like blood? The young priest tried to leave the church that night, but Father Brennan was waiting for him at the main entrance. Gone was any pretense of clerical dignity. The man who stood before Father O'Sullivan was no longer a priest, but a predator whose true nature had finally been revealed. "You've seen too much," Father Brennan said, his voice calm, but his eyes reflecting a coldness that seemed to come from somewhere beyond human experience. Father O'Sullivan demanded to know what had happened to the missing priests, what those chambers in the basement were used for, and who was behind the elaborate deception. Father Brennan's response was to signal to 2 men who emerged from the shadows behind the altar. They were not parishioners. They were not even American, judging by their clothing and manner. They moved with the efficiency of professionals, and Father O'Sullivan realized with growing horror that this was not Father Brennan's first encounter with someone who had asked too many questions. "The work we do here serves a higher purpose than your limited understanding can grasp," Father Brennan explained as the 2 men bound Father O'Sullivan's hands with rope. "For centuries, the church has been weakened by men who lack the strength to do what is necessary. We are correcting that weakness." What followed was 3 days of interrogation that Father O'Sullivan would later describe in the brief testimony he managed to give before his own disappearance, as a systematic attempt to break not just his body, but his very soul. The questions weren't about what he had seen or who he might tell. They were about his faith itself, his commitment to the church, his willingness to sacrifice everything, including his life, for what he believed. But the most terrifying aspect of those 3 days wasn't the physical torture, It was the realization that Father Brennan truly believed he was doing God's work. This wasn't a simple case of a madman who had infiltrated the church. This was something far more insidious, a corruption that had taken root at the very heart of religious authority and twisted it into something unrecognizable. On the fourth day, Father O'Sullivan was given a choice. He could join Father Brennan's work, becoming part of what the older priest called the true church, or he could join the other priests who had refused. The choice was presented as a test of faith, but Father O'Sullivan understood that it was really a choice between collaboration and death. He chose death. But death, as Father O'Sullivan would soon learn, was not the end of Father Brennan's twisted theology. It was merely the beginning of a purification process that would continue long after the victim's last breath. The basement chambers weren't just places of torture and murder. They were laboratories where Father Brennan conducted experiments on the human soul itself, believing that extreme suffering could separate the spiritual essence from the physical body and reveal the true nature of divine grace. The priests who disappeared from St. Agnes Church didn't die quickly. They were kept alive for months, sometimes years, as Father Brennan subjected them to increasingly elaborate rituals designed to test their faith under the most extreme conditions imaginable. He documented everything in detailed journals, recording not just their physical responses, but what he interpreted as spiritual transformations occurring as their bodies were systematically broken down. Father Patrick Donovan, who had arrived at St. Agnes in 1852 for what was supposed to be a brief retreat, was found chained in one of the basement chambers when authorities finally raided the church in 1859. He had been there for 2 years, his hair and beard grown long and wild, his body bearing the marks of countless tortures. But it was his eyes that investigators would remember most clearly. They were the eyes of a man who had seen something that no human being should ever witness. He believed he was saving us, Father Donovan whispered when he was finally freed. He said the pain was necessary to burn away our human weaknesses and reveal the divine spark within. He said God spoke to him directly, giving him instructions for each trial we endured. He kept journals, detailed records of our responses. The raid on St. Agnes Church came about not through any investigation by church authorities, but through the persistence of Margaret O'Sullivan, the sister of the missing father Michael O'Sullivan. When her brother failed to return from his visitation to St. Agnes, she began asking questions that the church hierarchy found increasingly uncomfortable. Her inquiries led to the discovery of other missing priests, all of whom had last been seen at St. Agnes Church. The federal agents, who finally entered the church in November 1859, found a scene that defied comprehension. The bones of murdered priests were positioned in poses of prayer or supplication, their skulls bearing carved symbols that Father Brennan claimed were divine revelations received during their final moments. Each priest's ordeal was recorded in clinical detail, with particular attention paid to the moment Father Brennan believed their souls had been successfully separated from their bodies. He wrote of conversations with the divine, of receiving direct instructions from God about how to conduct his rituals, and of his conviction that he was preparing the way for a new form of Christianity that would be purified of all human weakness. The man who called himself Father Thomas Brennan was arrested without resistance. He showed no remorse for what he had done, no recognition that his actions constituted anything other than the most sacred duty a priest could perform. "You cannot arrest the hand of God," he told his captors. "The work will continue with or without this vessel." His trial in Boston in 1860 was conducted largely in secret, with most of the evidence sealed from public view. The Catholic Church, already facing persecution and suspicion in Protestant America, could not afford to have the full extent of Father Brennan's crimes become public knowledge. The official story was that a deranged individual had infiltrated the church and committed isolated acts of violence before being apprehended and brought to justice. But the reality was far more complex and disturbing. Father Brennan had not acted alone. The investigation revealed a network of individuals within the church who had been aware of his activities and had either actively participated or deliberately turned a blind eye. The wealthy benefactors whose donations had funded his operations were real, powerful men who had been convinced that Father Brennan's work represented the future of Catholic theology. Even more disturbing were the connections that investigators found between Father Brennan and certain high-ranking church officials. Letters seized from his quarters indicated that his activities at St. Agnes were part of a larger experiment, one that had the tacit approval of individuals whose names were never made public, but whose influence extended to the highest levels of the American Catholic hierarchy. Father Brennan was executed in 1861, but his death did not end the investigation. Federal agents continued to uncover evidence of similar activities at other churches throughout New England and the mid-Atlantic states. The pattern was always the same. A charismatic priest would arrive at a remote parish, begin attracting unusual donations from wealthy benefactors, and then local priests would begin disappearing under mysterious circumstances. The full scope of what investigators came to call the Brennan Network was never fully revealed to the public. Church records from that period remain sealed to this day, and many of the government files related to the case are still classified. What is known is that at least 12 other churches were found to have similar basement chambers, and that the total number of murdered priests may have exceeded 100. The cover-up that followed was as systematic as the crimes themselves. Churches were quietly closed and demolished. Surviving victims were relocated to distant parishes with strict instructions never to speak of their experiences. Families of the murdered priests were provided with false documentation showing that their loved ones had died of natural causes while serving in remote missions. Most importantly, the ideological framework that had motivated Father Brennan's crimes was carefully studied and documented by church authorities, not to prevent its recurrence, but to understand how such beliefs could take root within the institution. The journals and theological writings seized from St. Agnes Church became the subject of intense scrutiny by Vatican scholars, who were apparently as interested in Father Brennan's methods as they were horrified by his crimes. This brings us to the most disturbing aspect of the entire affair. Father Brennan's conviction that extreme suffering could reveal divine truth was not entirely his own invention. It had roots in certain esoteric traditions within Catholic mysticism, traditions that had been suppressed by the Church for centuries, but had never been completely eliminated. His innovation was not in the concept of sanctified suffering, but in the systematic application of that concept to fellow priests. The documents I've obtained suggest that Father Brennan's work was seen by some church authorities not as heretical deviation, but as a logical extension of certain accepted theological principles. The idea that priests should be willing to suffer for their faith was hardly controversial. Father Brennan had simply taken that principle to its ultimate conclusion, using actual torture and murder to test the limits of priestly devotion. The most chilling evidence of this institutional complicity came from a letter written by Bishops William Tyler of Boston to Cardinal Alessandro Franchi in Rome. The Cardinal's response, found in the Vatican Secret Archives in 1978, was equally disturbing. This commission, operating under the innocuous name Committee for the Study of Priestly Devotion, continued its work well into the 20th century. Its members included some of the most respected theologians and canon lawyers in the Catholic Church, and its deliberations were conducted in absolute secrecy. The committee's final report, completed in 1923, has never been made public, but fragments that have leaked suggest that it endorsed certain enhanced forms of priestly training that incorporated elements of Father Brennan's methodology. The implications of this institutional response extend far beyond the specific crimes committed at St. Agnes Church. They suggest that the Catholic Church's approach to clerical authority, obedience, and suffering was influenced by the very ideology that had motivated Father Brennan's murders. The emphasis on absolute obedience to church authority, the glorification of suffering as a path to spiritual perfection, and the treatment of priests as instruments of divine will rather than autonomous individuals all bear the fingerprints of Father Brennan's twisted theology. This influence can be traced through subsequent decades in the Church's handling of clerical abuse cases. The same pattern emerges again and again: systematic cover-ups, the relocation of problematic priests to new parishes, the prioritization of institutional reputation over victim welfare, and the treatment of abuse as a spiritual failing rather than a criminal act. The DNA of Father Brennan's approach to sanctified suffering runs through all of these responses. The 23 skeletons found beneath St. Agnes Church in 1971 represent more than just the victims of one madman's delusions. They are the physical evidence of a corruption that took root at the very heart of American Catholicism and spread throughout the institution like a cancer. The fact that their discovery was covered up, that the site was sealed, and the evidence removed before proper investigation could take place suggests that this corruption persists to this day. The Catholic Church has never officially acknowledged the full scope of Father Brennan's crimes or the institutional complicity that enabled them. The priests who died in those basement chambers have never been properly honored or remembered. Their families were never told the truth about how their loved ones died. Their sacrifice in refusing to participate in Father Brennan's twisted vision of purified Christianity has been erased from church history. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this entire affair is the possibility that Father Brennan's work never truly ended. The network of supporters and collaborators that enabled his crimes was never fully exposed. The theological framework that justified his actions was never thoroughly repudiated. The institutional structures that allowed such corruption to flourish were never fundamentally reformed. In researching this story, I've encountered evidence suggesting that similar activities may have continued at other locations, hidden behind the same veil of religious authority and institutional secrecy that protected Father Brennan for so many years. Reports of missing priests, unexplained disappearances, and mysterious deaths continue to surface, only to be quickly suppressed or explained away by church authorities. The basement chambers beneath St. Agnes Church were sealed with concrete after the 1971 discovery, but the evil that was practiced there was never truly buried. It lives on in the institutional culture that enabled it, in the theological traditions that justified it, and in the ongoing cover-ups that protect it from scrutiny. The lost priests of St. Agnes Church deserve to be remembered not just as victims, but as heroes who chose death rather than compromise their principles. Their refusal to participate in Father Brennan's vision of purified Christianity through sanctified suffering stands as a testament to the power of individual conscience against institutional corruption. Their story serves as a warning about the dangers of unchecked religious authority and the human capacity for evil disguised as divine purpose. It reminds us that the most horrific crimes are often committed not by those who reject moral authority, but by those who claim to represent it. The secrets buried beneath St. Agnes Church may have been hidden for over a century, but the truth they represent cannot be suppressed forever. The lost priests of St. Agnes Church call out to us across the years, demanding that their sacrifice be remembered and that the corruption that caused their deaths be finally exposed to the light. Their voices echo from those sealed basement chambers, reminding us that the price of institutional silence is measured not just in individual suffering, but in the moral integrity of the institutions we trust to guide us toward truth and justice. The Catholic Church's failure to confront the full truth about Father Brennan and his network of collaborators represents more than just a historical cover-up. It represents an ongoing betrayal of everything the Church claims to stand for. The lost priests of St. Agnes Church were not just victims of one man's madness. They were casualties in a war between institutional power and individual conscience, between the corruption of authority and the purity of faith. Their death was not in vain if we learn from their sacrifice and refuse to let such corruption take root again in the institutions we trust. But that can only happen if we remember them, if we tell their story, and if we demand accountability from those who would hide the truth behind walls of secrecy and claims of divine authority. The winter of 1858 brought an unexpected visitor to St. Agnes Church in Massachusetts, a man whose arrival would transform the quiet parish into something far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. Father Marcus Whitmore appeared at the rectory door on a bitter December morning, carrying credentials that seemed impeccable and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. Bishop Patrick O'Sullivan had personally recommended Father Whitmore for the position, praising his theological expertise and his previous work at parishes throughout New England. The aging Father Timothy O'Brien, who had served St. Agnes for 37 years, welcomed the younger priest with genuine warmth, grateful for assistance with his growing congregation and failing health. What Father O'Brien didn't know was that the man calling himself Marcus Whitmore had never attended seminary, had never taken holy orders, and had spent the previous 15 years perfecting the art of infiltrating religious institutions for purposes that had nothing to do with salvation. Born Jonathan Blackwood in rural Vermont, he had discovered early in life that people would trust a man in clerical clothing with their deepest secrets, their children, and their lives. His first successful impersonation had been at a small Methodist church in New Hampshire, where he had spent 2 years studying the congregation's habits and vulnerabilities before systematically robbing them blind and disappearing into the night. But simple theft had grown boring. The real power, he had learned, lay not in taking people's money, but in taking their souls, in shaping their faith into something that served his darker purposes, in convincing them that suffering was not just inevitable, but necessary, even sacred. St. Agnes Church, with its isolated location and trusting parishioners, represented the perfect laboratory for his evolving philosophy. The congregation numbered just over 200 souls, mostly Irish immigrants and their families who had settled in the area to work in the textile mills. They were people accustomed to hardship, to accepting authority without question, to finding meaning in suffering. Father Whitmore's first innovation was the introduction of special confession sessions held in the basement of the church, where he claimed the proximity to the earth enhanced spiritual connection. These sessions, initially welcomed by parishioners seeking deeper spiritual guidance, gradually became something else entirely. Margaret Flynn, a young mother of 3, was among the first to experience Father Whitmore's unique approach to spiritual counseling. Her husband had died in a mill accident, leaving her struggling to support her children on a seamstress's wages. When she came to Father Whitmore seeking comfort, he told her that her suffering was a gift from God, a chance to purify her soul through pain. The basement sessions became longer and more frequent. Father Whitmore introduced what he called mortification exercises, convincing parishioners that physical discomfort was necessary for spiritual growth. He cited biblical passages about Christ's suffering, about the early martyrs who had found God through agony, about the necessity of dying to oneself to be reborn in faith. What began as simple fasting and prayer vigils gradually escalated into something far more disturbing. Father Whitmore had installed special equipment in the basement rooms, devices he claimed were used by medieval saints for spiritual purification, restraints for extended prayer sessions, implements for self-flagellation, chambers designed to induce the kind of sensory deprivation that could lead to religious visions. By the spring of 1859, more than 50 parishioners were participating in these advanced spiritual exercises. They spoke of profound religious experiences, of visions of heaven and hell, of feeling closer to God than ever before. What they didn't speak of were the injuries, the psychological trauma, and the growing number of fellow parishioners who had simply stopped attending these sessions and were never seen again. Father O'Brien, increasingly frail and confined to his quarters, relied entirely on Father Whitmore's reports about the parish's spiritual health. The younger priest assured him that the congregation was thriving, that donations were increasing, and that several parishioners had achieved such advanced states of spiritual development that they had been sent to special retreat centers for continued growth. The truth was far more horrifying. Father Whitmore had been carefully selecting the most isolated and vulnerable members of his congregation for what he termed final purification. These chosen ones were taken to a specially constructed chamber beneath the church basement, where they underwent rituals that bore no resemblance to any legitimate religious practice. The chamber, accessed through a hidden door behind the altar, had been excavated and constructed by Father Whitmore himself during his first months at St. Agnes. Working only at night, he had created a space that would have been more at home in a medieval dungeon than beneath a house of God. Stone walls lined with chains and restraints, a ceiling carved with symbols that belonged to no Christian tradition, an altar stained with substances that were not wine. Thomas McBride, a mill worker who had fallen behind on his rent and feared eviction, was among the first to be selected for final purification. Father Whitmore had convinced him that his financial troubles were a sign of spiritual inadequacy, that only through complete surrender to God's will could he find peace. The ritual that followed lasted 3 days and ended with Thomas's death, from what Father Whitmore recorded in his private journal as voluntary martyrdom. The bodies of those who achieved final purification were disposed of in a specially constructed crypt beneath the chamber. Father Whitmore had studied anatomy during his years of preparation, learning how to preserve remains in ways that would prevent detection. He told the congregation that these blessed souls had been taken directly to heaven, their earthly forms no longer needed. By 1860, Father Whitmore's operation had expanded beyond simple murder. He had begun selling his services to wealthy patrons who shared his fascination with the intersection of pain and spiritual transcendence. Men from Boston and New York would travel to St. Agnes for private sessions with specially selected parishioners, paying substantial sums for the privilege of witnessing or participating in what Father Whitmore called sacred theater. The money from these activities funded the expansion of the underground chambers and the acquisition of more sophisticated equipment. Father Whitmore studied the latest medical texts, learning about human anatomy and the limits of physical endurance. He corresponded with like-minded individuals in Europe, sharing techniques and philosophies that blended religious mysticism with calculated cruelty. Meanwhile, the congregation above remained largely unaware of what was happening beneath their feet. Those who asked about missing parishioners were told that these blessed souls had been called to higher service, either at distant monasteries or in heaven itself. The increasing frequency of these disappearances was explained as evidence of the parish's spiritual growth, proof that St. Agnes was producing saints at an unprecedented rate. Father O'Brien died in his sleep in November 1860, never learning the true nature of his assistant's activities. His funeral was attended by nearly the entire congregation, who praised Father Whitmore's devoted care of the elderly priest and his leadership of the parish. The bishop, impressed by the reports of spiritual renewal at St. Agnes, appointed Father Whitmore as the permanent pastor. With complete control of the parish, Father Whitmore's activities escalated dramatically. He began recruiting new members from surrounding communities, particularly targeting those who had lost family members or faced financial hardship. His sermons about finding meaning in suffering resonated with people struggling to make sense of their difficulties, drawing them into his web of manipulation and control. The winter of 1860 marked the beginning of what Father Whitmore privately called his great work. He had developed a systematic approach to breaking down human resistance, using a combination of sleep deprivation, isolation, and carefully calibrated physical discomfort to create a state of psychological dependence. His subjects would become completely convinced that their suffering was not only necessary, but sacred, that their pain was bringing them closer to God. Sarah Brennan, a young woman who had joined the congregation after her father's death, became one of Father Whitmore's most devoted followers. She spoke eloquently about her spiritual journey, about the peace she had found through accepting God's will, about the joy she experienced during the purification rituals. Her testimonies convinced other parishioners to embrace Father Whitmore's teachings more fully. What Sarah didn't tell them was that she had been so thoroughly broken by months of psychological and physical abuse that she could no longer distinguish between pain and pleasure, between reality and the fevered visions that Father Whitmore had taught her to interpret as divine communication. She had become a living testament to the power of systematic psychological manipulation, a walking advertisement for the effectiveness of Father Whitmore's methods. By 1861, St. Agnes Church had become something unprecedented in American religious history. On the surface, it remained a functioning Catholic parish with regular masses, community events, and charitable activities. Beneath the surface, it housed a sophisticated operation that combined elements of cult indoctrination, medical experimentation, and ritualized murder. Father Whitmore had documented everything in detailed journals, treating his activities as a form of research that would advance human understanding of pain, faith, and the limits of human endurance. He believed he was conducting important work that would eventually be recognized and celebrated, even if it took decades for society to evolve enough to appreciate his contributions. The underground chambers had expanded to include specialized rooms for different types of activities. The preparation chamber, where subjects were conditioned through weeks of psychological manipulation. The observation chamber, where paying clients could witness the rituals from behind specially installed windows. The preservation chamber, where bodies were processed using techniques Father Whitmore had developed through years of experimentation. Most disturbing was the innovation chamber, where Father Whitmore tested new methods of inducing physical and psychological stress. He had become fascinated by the human capacity for endurance, by the point at which faith transformed into desperation, by the moment when the will to live finally surrendered to the desire for release. The parishioners who survived these experiences were forever changed. They spoke of transcendent spiritual experiences, of visions of heaven and hell, of feeling chosen by God for special purposes. They became eager recruiters for Father Whitmore's programs, drawing their friends and family members into the congregation with testimonies about the profound spiritual growth they had experienced. But the human cost was staggering. By the end of 1861, more than 60 parishioners had achieved what Father Whitmore termed final purification. Dozens more had been permanently damaged by their experiences, their minds shattered by trauma they had been taught to interpret as divine blessing. The community that had once been a source of comfort and support had become a machine for producing suffering and death. The Civil War provided perfect cover for Father Whitmore's activities. With young men leaving for military service and families disrupted by the conflict, the disappearance of individuals could be easily explained as war-related. Father Whitmore even established a special fund to support families of soldiers, using the donations to further expand his underground operation. As 1862 dawned, Father Whitmore stood at the pulpit of St. Agnes Church, looking out at a congregation that had been systematically traumatized and indoctrinated over the course of 4 years. Many of the original parishioners were gone, replaced by new recruits who had been drawn by promises of spiritual fulfillment and community support. He smiled as he began his sermon, knowing that beneath his feet lay the bodies of those who had served his greater purpose. The great work was far from complete, but he had proven that human beings could be convinced to embrace their own destruction if it was presented in the right theological framework. What Father Whitmore didn't know was that his activities had finally attracted the attention of someone with the power and determination to stop him. The discovery of the underground chambers and the horrifying truth about St. Agnes Church was only months away, but the revelation would come too late for the dozens of souls who had already been sacrificed on the altar of one man's twisted vision of religious devotion. The stage was set for a confrontation that would expose not just the crimes of a single madman, but the institutional failures that had allowed such horror to flourish in the shadow of the cross. The winter morning of February 14th, 1863, dawned gray and bitter over the Massachusetts countryside, with frost covering the headstones in Mount Calvary Cemetery and smoke rising from the chimneys of nearby Boston. But inside the secure chambers beneath St. Agnes Church, a horror was unfolding that would make the previous atrocities seem like mere preparation for what Father Marcus Whitmore had planned for this most sacred of Christian holidays. The Valentine's Day Massacre, as it would later be known in sealed church documents, represented the culmination of everything Whitmore had learned from his predecessor, Father Thomas Brennan. But where Brennan had been methodical and calculating, Whitmore had become something far more dangerous, a man who had convinced himself that his actions were not just justified, but divinely mandated. In the months following his appointment as head of St. Agnes, Whitmore had expanded the underground chambers considerably. The chamber of preparation, where selected priests would spend their final days in isolation and prayer. The chamber of trials, where the actual experiments took place. The chamber of ascension, where those who had served their purpose would meet their end. And most disturbing of all, the chamber of saints, where the remains of his victims were preserved and displayed in grotesque tableaux of false worship. By early 1863, Whitmore had refined his methods to a terrifying degree of efficiency. This involved a combination of psychological manipulation, chemical experimentation, and ritualized abuse that pushed the boundaries of human endurance while maintaining the facade of religious devotion. Father Patrick O'Sullivan, who had arrived at St. Agnes in January of 1863, would later provide the most detailed account of Whitmore's operations to surviving investigators. O'Sullivan, a young priest from Ireland with a background in philosophy and natural sciences, had been specifically recruited by Whitmore for his intellectual capabilities and his isolation from the broader Catholic community in America. Father Whitmore possessed a charisma that was almost supernatural, O'Sullivan recalled in his testimony. When he spoke of the need to purify the priesthood, to create a new order of clergy capable of communicating directly with the divine, it seemed not just reasonable, but necessary. The process by which Whitmore selected his victims had become increasingly sophisticated. He would invite priests to St. Agnes under the pretense of participating in advanced theological studies or special retreats. These men, typically young and idealistic, would be gradually introduced to Whitmore's theories about the relationship between suffering and spiritual enlightenment. Those who showed enthusiasm for his ideas would be invited to witness demonstrations of his techniques. Those who expressed doubts or reservations would find themselves becoming subjects of those same techniques. Father Michael Donnelly, a 28-year-old priest from Philadelphia, had been at St. Agnes for 3 weeks when he wrote his final letter home. The letter, intercepted by Whitmore's associates before it could be sent, was discovered years later hidden in the church's archives. "Something is terribly wrong here," Donnelly wrote. "The practices Father Whitmore calls spiritual exercises are unlike anything I learned in seminary. Yesterday I was required to observe as he conducted what he called an elevation ceremony with Father McKenna. I cannot describe what I witnessed without losing my sanity. I fear I have stumbled into something evil beyond comprehension." Donnelly's letter was dated February 13th, 1863. He would not survive the night. The Valentine's Day massacre began at dawn on February 14th, when Whitmore announced to the 17 priests currently in residence at St. Agnes that they would be participating in a special ceremony to commemorate the martyrdom of St. Valentine. The historical St. Valentine, Whitmore explained, had been tortured and executed by Roman authorities for his refusal to convert to paganism. This made him the perfect patron for what Whitmore called the new martyrdom, the voluntary acceptance of suffering in service of divine revelation. What followed was a coordinated slaughter that demonstrated both Whitmore's complete descent into madness and his terrifying organizational capabilities. The priests were divided into groups of 3, each assigned to a different chamber in the underground complex. Whitmore had prepared detailed protocols for each group, with specific procedures designed to test different aspects of human endurance and spiritual resilience. This involved being bound to wooden crosses and forced to recite prayers while being slowly tortured with heated implements. The purpose, according to Whitmore's notes, was to determine whether extreme physical pain could induce genuine religious visions, or whether such experiences were merely psychological responses to trauma. These men were administered various chemical compounds that Whitmore had obtained through his connections with medical professionals in Boston. The substances, including laudanum, chloroform, and various botanical extracts, were designed to induce altered states of consciousness, while the subjects were subjected to controlled forms of torture. The remaining priests were distributed among the other chambers, each group serving as subjects for different aspects of Whitmore's research. Some were used to test the effects of prolonged isolation and sensory deprivation. Others were subjected to near-drowning experiences to study what Whitmore believed were the spiritual implications of approaching death. Still others were used in experiments designed to test the relationship between physical pain and religious ecstasy. Throughout the day, Whitmore moved between the chambers, documenting his observations with clinical precision. His notes from that day, preserved in the church archives, reveal a man who had completely lost touch with human empathy while retaining his intellectual faculties. Subject 3 achieved a state of apparent transcendence after 47 minutes of controlled pressure application, reads one entry. Vocalizations shifted from pleas for mercy to what appeared to be glossolalia. Heart rate remained elevated but stable. As the day progressed, Whitmore's experiments became increasingly extreme. He had become convinced that the moment of death itself was the key to achieving direct communication with the divine, and he developed elaborate procedures for bringing his subjects to the brink of death repeatedly while monitoring their responses. Some priests were subjected to controlled drowning, being revived multiple times to extend their suffering. Others were bled slowly while being forced to describe their experiences as consciousness faded. The most horrifying aspect of the Valentine's Day Massacre was not the physical torture itself, but the way Whitmore had convinced several of his victims to participate willingly in their own destruction. Through months of psychological manipulation and theological argument, he had persuaded some priests that their suffering was not just meaningful, but necessary for the advancement of human spiritual understanding. Father James Murphy, according to Whitmore's notes, actually thanked his tormentor as he was being prepared for what would be his final experiment. Father Murphy expressed gratitude for the opportunity to serve the greater glory of God through his sacrifice, Whitmore wrote. His willingness to embrace suffering demonstrates the success of our preparatory conditioning. By evening, 13 priests had died in the underground chambers of St. Agnes Church. The 4 survivors, including Father O'Sullivan, were left alive not out of mercy, but because Whitmore wanted witnesses to his triumph. He had become convinced that what he had accomplished represented a breakthrough in human understanding of the relationship between the physical and spiritual realms. The aftermath of the Valentine's Day Massacre revealed the full extent of Whitmore's network of support and protection. Despite the obvious evidence of mass murder, local authorities were slow to investigate. Sheriff William Brennan, a distant cousin of the former priest, had been receiving regular payments from church funds for years. Dr. Samuel Richardson, the county coroner, had been compromised through his receipt of bodies for anatomical study. Even Bishop Francis McCloskey, who had initially supported the investigation of St. Agnes, suddenly became reluctant to pursue the matter after receiving what he described as clarifying information about the true nature of the events. The cover-up might have been successful had it not been for the persistence of Father O'Sullivan, who had managed to escape from St. Agnes during the confusion following the massacre. Despite threats to his life and attempts to discredit his testimony, O'Sullivan continued to seek justice for his murdered colleagues. His detailed account of the events, combined with physical evidence discovered in the church's underground chambers, eventually forced a comprehensive investigation that would expose not just Whitmore's crimes, but the entire network of corruption that had protected him. The investigation revealed that Whitmore had not acted alone. In addition to his network of corrupted officials, he had been assisted by a group of laymen who had been recruited through a combination of financial incentives and religious manipulation. These men, who called themselves the Order of Sacred Suffering, had helped Whitmore conduct his experiments and dispose of evidence. Some had even participated directly in the torture and murder of priests, believing that they were serving God's will. Most disturbing was the discovery that Whitmore had been documenting his activities, not just for his own purposes, but as part of a larger research program. His correspondence with physicians and academics in Boston New York, and Philadelphia revealed a network of individuals who were interested in his findings about pain, death, and consciousness. While most of these correspondents claimed ignorance of his methods, the sophistication of their questions and the specificity of their requests for information suggested a level of knowledge that went beyond casual academic interest. The Valentine's Day Massacre also revealed the existence of what Whitmore called his theological laboratory, a collection of writings and artifacts that demonstrated his systematic attempt to create a new form of Christianity based on the worship of suffering. His personal chapel, discovered in the deepest level of the underground complex, contained altars made from the bones of his victims, religious texts that had been altered to emphasize pain and death, and artwork depicting scenes of torture presented as acts of divine worship. The scope of Whitmore's crimes extended far beyond the events of February 14, 1863. Investigation of the church's records revealed that he had been conducting experiments on priests for over 2 years, with the Valentine's Day Massacre representing merely the largest single incident. In total, investigators documented the deaths of 37 priests at St. Agnes between 1861 and 1863, though the actual number may have been higher. The psychological impact of Whitmore's crimes on the Catholic Church in America was profound and lasting. The revelation that a trusted priest had systematically tortured and murdered his colleagues shattered the faith of many Catholics and provided ammunition for anti-Catholic sentiment that was already prevalent in 19th century America. The Church's initial attempts to cover up the crimes only deepened the scandal and reinforced suspicions about institutional corruption. The investigation also revealed connections between Whitmore's activities and similar incidents at other Catholic institutions across the country. Reports of missing priests, suspicious deaths, and unusual practices at seminaries and churches in New York, Pennsylvania, and Maryland suggested that Whitmore's network of corruption extended far beyond Massachusetts. While many of these connections were never fully investigated due to the Church's resistance to broader scrutiny, the pattern suggested a systematic problem within American Catholicism that went far beyond the actions of a single deranged priest. The fate of Father Marcus Whitmore himself remained one of the most disturbing aspects of the entire case. Despite overwhelming evidence of his crimes and the testimony of multiple witnesses, Whitmore was never brought to trial. On the night before his scheduled arrest, he disappeared from St. Agnes Church, leaving behind only a note that read, "The work continues in other vessels. The spirit of purification cannot be contained by earthly authorities." The search for Whitmore continued for months, with reports of sightings across the country. Some placed him in California, where he was allegedly attempting to establish a new religious community among gold miners. Others claimed he had fled to Mexico or South America, where he could continue his work beyond the reach of American law enforcement. The most credible sighting came from a priest in New Orleans who reported encountering a man matching Whitmore's description conducting unusual religious ceremonies in the city's French Quarter. By the time authorities investigated, however, the man had disappeared. The mystery of Whitmore's disappearance was compounded by the discovery of evidence suggesting that he had been planning his escape for months. Hidden caches of money, forged identity documents, and correspondence with unknown associates indicated that Whitmore had anticipated the eventual exposure of his crimes and had prepared accordingly. This level of preparation suggested either remarkable foresight or assistance from powerful allies who remained hidden. The underground chambers beneath St. Agnes Church were sealed permanently in 1864, with the entrances filled with concrete and the areas above converted to other uses. The church itself was deconsecrated and eventually demolished, with the land sold to private developers. No marker was ever erected to commemorate the priests who died there, and their names were quietly removed from official church records. The broader implications of the St. Agnes case extended far beyond the immediate crimes. The revelation that such systematic abuse could occur within the Catholic Church raised fundamental questions about religious authority, institutional oversight, and the protection of vulnerable individuals within religious communities. These questions would continue to resonate throughout American history, finding new relevance in later scandals involving Catholic institutions. The case also highlighted the dangerous intersection of religious fervor and pseudoscientific inquiry that characterized certain aspects of 19th century American culture. Whitmore's attempt to use religious doctrine to justify what were essentially medical experiments reflected broader tensions between faith and reason, tradition and progress that were reshaping American society during this period. Perhaps most significantly, the St. Agnes case demonstrated the capacity for evil that could exist within seemingly sacred institutions when proper oversight and accountability were absent. The network of corruption that protected Whitmore, the willingness of officials to ignore evidence of wrongdoing, and the institutional pressure to maintain secrecy at all costs created conditions that enabled unprecedented atrocities to occur under the cover of religious devotion. The story of the lost priests of St. Agnes Church remains one of the darkest chapters in American religious history, a reminder that the potential for both great good and great evil exists within all human institutions, regardless of their sacred character. The 23 priests who died in those underground chambers were not just victims of one man's madness, but casualties of a system that valued reputation over truth, silence over justice, and institutional preservation over human life. Their sacrifice, though tragic, was not entirely in vain. The exposure of the crimes at St. Agnes led to significant reforms in Catholic seminary training, improved oversight of religious institutions, and greater transparency in the handling of allegations of abuse. While these changes came too late for the victims of Father Whitmore's experiments, they helped prevent similar tragedies from occurring in the future. The legacy of St. Agnes Church serves as a perpetual warning about the dangers of unchecked authority, the importance of institutional accountability, and the need for constant vigilance in protecting the vulnerable from those who would exploit their trust. In remembering the lost priests of St. Agnes, we honor not just their memory, but our collective responsibility to ensure that such horrors never occur again within the sacred walls of religious institutions. The investigation into St. Agnes Church ultimately revealed that the true horror lay not in the acts of individual criminals, but in the systematic failure of institutions designed to protect the innocent. The network of corruption, the culture of secrecy, and the willingness to sacrifice truth for convenience created conditions that enabled evil to flourish unchecked. The story of the Church of the Pure Spirit stands as one of America's most chilling examples of how religious authority can mask unspeakable evil. From 1825 to 1851, the Ravencroft brothers orchestrated a reign of terror that claimed over 400 lives, all while maintaining the facade of devout religious leaders. Their systematic torture, murder, and human experimentation, disguised as spiritual purification, reminds us that the greatest monsters often hide behind the most sacred masks. Though Elder Ezra may have escaped justice and his ultimate fate remains unknown, the legacy of their crimes serves as an eternal warning about the dangers of blind faith and unchecked authority. The unmarked graves in those New York forests bear silent witness to the truth that evil, no matter how carefully concealed, will eventually be exposed to the light, 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 exposed to the light.